Oh, okay.
Oh, better than that.
Disappointed to get that stuff. I guess you're.
One or the other, it's not just the church,
Right.
second.
Right.
Return.
Okay, I'll tell her to marry that. CBS, wonder what CBS will have. Anyway, they can go.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody.
You'll have to get an appointment. You'll have to ask them.
Okay.
Yeah, we could go in there.
Good afternoon, everybody. So this week, we're not doing a monster per se, and as I said the first couple weeks back, I'm doing a short history of China because I have this extra week, and I thought, well, since China is pretty much a mystery to most Americans, including myself, I thought this would be a good introduction to the week before Mao Zedong. So, but of course I have to start off with what I forgot last week. And so I have a quote from Boris Pasternak. Who knows Boris Pasternak? Oh wow, this is great, very well educated. So what did he write? Dr. Zhivago. One of the great writers, Russian writers of the 20th century. So this is his quote after the Nazis invaded Russia. This is how he felt. When the war broke out, the real horrors were a blessing compared to the inhuman power of the lie. The war came as a relief because it broke the spell of the dead letter. So that was his feeling. After all these years of having to say everything's wonderful here in Russia while people are dying all around you, and still have a smile on your face and say Stalin is a wonderful guy, then the Nazis invade. And now you can tell the truth. Things are horrible because the Nazis are killing everybody. So that was his take on the contrast between Hitler and Stalin. The other thing I wanted to say about Stalin, as if you didn't realize how evil he was already, one of the things that he would do in the high-level accusation, when it was a high-level person in the government who was going to be arrested and put on trial, the night before they were going to arrest any given person, Stalin would call this person up and say, look, everything's going to be okay, okay? I know you are under the gun, people are accusing you, but believe me, I'm going to take care of this, everything's going to be fine. And then the next day, the person would be arrested, put on trial, and eventually shot. The reason he did that is because he did not want them committing suicide. That was the thing. A lot of people knew that you didn't have much of a chance when you were arrested. And so it was better to commit suicide. And so to prevent that, he would call them up and reassure them that everything's going to be fine. So yeah, Stalin is one of the worst. Okay, a short history of China. How in the world do you do 3,000 or 4,000 years in 1 hour? Well, watch me. My consolation is that I'm assuming that you know even less than I do. And so anything I give you is going to be something more than you know already.
I resemble that.
Okay, so the bibliography I have, this first one is a really nice introduction to China. It's like a textbook that they would use in a college. I'm sure it's used it maybe in this one. Short History of China. 310 pages. reads like a textbook, but it's a good introduction. If you don't know much about Chinese history, and who does in America, this is a good start. This next one, John King Fairbank, China, A New History. Why in the world anyone would put a new history on the title of any book doesn't make sense to me, because it's only going to be new for a couple of years, and yet the title will still be there. This is 1992. It is not a new history anymore. So, but anyway, it is a good read. This was done very well. This guy gets into the culture of China pretty decently and explains a lot of things very nicely. So yeah, I could recommend this one. And then the last one, Jonathan D. Spence, The Search for Modern China. This is 1990, 876 pages, so it's not an easy, short read, but it is an excellent read. The one thing about this, though, it only covers from about 1600, so it's not an ancient, doesn't go back to the ancient times, but it covers very well the more modern times in China. So, the land of China. What does China look like? Has 5 major rivers and 2 great rivers. And I think many of you, if you know anything about the land of China, you know at least these 2 rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. The Yellow River being 2,700 miles long, and the Yangtze 3,200. The Yellow River is known as China's sorrow because it floods so frequently, and it has been the cause of literally millions of deaths over the centuries. And the Yangtze River is far more navigable, up to 1,000 miles inland, so it's a lot more serviceable in that sense. It also floods occasionally and kills quite a lot of people, and it plays into the history of China. Many a dynasty has ended because of the unrest after these rivers have flooded. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, and more die in the famines that follow because all of the farmland is washed out. So, okay. So, in China, we have many mountain ranges, and they're not very well organized. They do not line up nicely like in the United States. We have the Appalachian Mountains going north and south. We have the Rocky Mountains north and south. We have the coastal mountains, Sierra Nevadas. They all kind of line up very nicely. They do not line up nicely in China. Dry and cold in the northwest, near the Gobi Desert. It's wet and fertile, the land in southeast, where they grow rice, tea, and mulberry trees. And we know what mulberry trees are for, don't we? Yes. The silkworms, the moths that eat the mulberry trees, and so that's how they get their silk. And the plains in the northeast in Manchuria, where they grow millet and wheat. So this is the topography. We see the Tibetan plain here, and a lot of just mountain ranges that have no distinct organization, and the Gobi Desert up here. And then we have the more fertile lands down here, and this is where the rivers flow down. And then Manchuria, where you have some very nice farmland and plains. The rivers, we have the 2 major rivers, the Yellow River here, and the Yangtze down here. Both originate up round about the Tibetan plains, the mountains up there. And then other major rivers up and down the coast there. So, the first dynasty, approximately 2205 to 1766 BC, the Xia, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but That's what I'm going to go with. Founded by Yu the Great. He's said to have improved flood control and irrigation, essential for any kind of civilization. The many rivers in China need to be tamed so that the farmland can be productive. There is, as a matter of fact, from what I've read, and this could be out of date, but no archaeological evidence for this dynasty, but it was written about by the great historian Sima Qian of the 2nd century BC, and he's the only known source. It was, at one time, historians weren't really sure whether to credit this historian with any accuracy because no archaeological evidence could be found for this dynasty. And then, so this is supposedly where the Zhao Dynasty was. So, sometime in the late 1800s, there were apothecary shops in China that were selling an elixir made from the bones of deer and draft animals, and they felt that these bones were magical and would produce health and whatever they were trying to sell from these apothecary shops. And then someone who knew the archaeology of China took a look at these bones and realized that these apothecaries were grinding up priceless artifacts because they had writing on them, very ancient writing. And so they got a hold of these, and because of these writings that some they could decipher, some they were not yet able to, they found the Shang Dynasty was a real dynasty. Before this, they weren't really sure. They had the historian that wrote about the Shang Dynasty, and now they had proof. And then they started excavating near the sites of where these bones were. So they have upwards of 50 cities excavated, and the dates are around 1523 to 1027 BC. Graves that had bronze treasures, human sacrifices. The royalty were usually buried with about 10 of their attendants with their heads cut off.
Wow.
Not terribly unusual given the times. Worldwide, that sort of thing was sadly quite common. This was the beginning of the Bronze Age. And so the apothecaries were calling these bones dragon bones because of the writings on them. And they were the shoulder blades of deer and oxen. And so here are some of the Shang treasures. The bronze goblets here are immaculate. For the time, they're truly amazing. And guess what this is? It looks like a mask, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's an axe. This is what you chop heads off with.
Oh my Lord, with a smile face on.
Yeah, with a smiley face. You're going to go with a smile. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. So here's the Shang Empire, territories. And moving along to the next dynasty. The Zhao Dynasty conquered the Shang in around about 1027 BC, and this one lasted till 221 BC, which was the longest period of time for any dynasty, although it may be somewhat misleading because it was kind of breaking up near the last several years. So, but they give it 221 as the ending. So the Zhao Dynasty, as we know, many wonderful inventions happened in China. They were created in China long before they were found out usually given to the Europeans. So the horse harness, the type of harness that does not just choke a horse when you yank on it, it's a shoulder harness. That way, when the horse is pulling the plow, you don't choke him. That was not discovered, or that was not used in Europe until more than 1,000 years later. Not until medieval times did Europeans use such a harness. Smelting, forging, and casting of iron. Forging, this is something I had to look up. What's the difference between forging and casting of iron? Does anybody know that one? Forging, you have this hunk of iron and you are pounding on it. Yes. Casting is where you melt it down and pour it into a cast. They did not have casting of iron in Europe until medieval times. It was used in China way back pre-BC, or before Christ anyway. So, yeah, well more than 1,000 years before Europeans did it. They had bellows with double pistons and valves so that as you lift it up and push it down, it breathes out both ways. So there were various tribes at this time in China that you had the high culture and the barbarians, something of a division. And the higher culture has always been in the south, southeast, and the barbarians have always been in the north. Because in the north, you eventually get to the steppes, where you have the nomadic tribes. So in the north, you have an intermixing of the tribal people and the settled farmers. And that will be, for the next couple thousand years, the tension that goes back and forth in China between the two. So here's some of the inventions. We have cast iron here, helmet. You have the kite, which is invented at this time. You have the crossbow. Coins are developed and used at this time. And the stirrup, another thing that was not introduced into Europe until medieval times. They had the stirrup, and there's the horse harness. And here's the Zhao Dynasty. And at each of these maps, you'll notice this is modern China, the boundaries, and this is the China at the time. So, the early religion of China. China developed their religions and philosophies very differently than us in the West. Their religions, like many religions, primitive religions, had a lot to do with ancestor worship. Ancestors who died must still be cared for. You have your little shrine, you make your offerings. That way, they are still alive. As long as you are remembering them, as long as you are taking care of them with your shrine and your offerings, they will still be around. It was the belief that if you stopped, then they disappeared. Lots of nature spirits, spirits of the wind, spirits of various animals, especially snakes. They were very into snakes, and then, of course, dragons. You have your Eastern and Western mother, spirits of the wind, a snake spirit, lots of fertility spirits. And this is, of course, universal. Anywhere you go, any society that is primitive in this way, you have lots of fertility spirits. It's very important. And then you have Confucius. It's a remarkable thing that Confucius, who lived 551 to 479, roundabout, in various parts of the world, fairly close to the same time period, you have your great thinkers. The Jews, a little bit later, had their Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, being put together, their prophets that they're writing, some very high-level intellectual thoughts. You have in Greece, you have your three great philosophers somewhat later on, but still, when you think of the thousands and thousands of years of human existence, the fact that so many of them, these different civilizations, would have great thinkers, some of the greatest of all time in world history, fairly close to each other and completely independently of each other, is pretty remarkable. So Confucius dominates more than anyone else. And the interesting thing too, as opposed to the Western experience, Confucius was completely non-religious. He went along with the local religions, did the ancestor worship, but quite pointedly avoided getting too involved with it. He was, I wouldn't say that he was totally secular, but his philosophy was completely secular. So, and I'll say this now, even though it comes up later, was a complete shock to people of the West. In the Western experience, we get our morals from religion. Christianity is the philosophy, the morality of the Western experience, all through medieval times. Judeo-Christian and Greek and Roman also. But once people from the West realized that China got its morality exclusively from a secular source, it was a shock. It was a new experience. So Confucius was very practical in his moral principles. He was not mystical at all. He promoted honesty, modesty, harmony, order in society, obedience to authority, and he was very the various classes of society and in all human relations had to do with levels. So you had your scholar, the most important of society, you have the scholars, they're at the top, according to him. Then you have the farmer, then you have the artisan, and then at the bottom was the merchant. And this was not unusual. In many societies throughout history, the merchant always seems to be at the bottom, very disdainful, because he's the one who cheats you when you're trying to buy things. And so I think it was to the credit of the West that eventually the merchant became a very important person, and that's how capitalism became the powerhouse that it is, and the prosperity. But that's another lecture.
Question.
Yes?
Was there a soldier class?
So that's what I was just about to mention at the bottom here. He had a great disdain for the military, which is kind of interesting. You wouldn't have expected that, but both the two great philosophies in Chinese history is Confucianism and Taoism, which I'll bring up right after this, and both of them have a great disdain for the military class, which is, I really don't get that, because China has had to defend itself, constantly. Like all societies, war is a very mundane thing. War is an almost constant thing between civilizations, between tribes, between various groups of people. Maybe, and this is just a thought off the top of my head, it's not my, this isn't something that you can really go with, but my guess is that China had at many times become so stable and society was so safe for long periods of time that they could afford to be disdainful of the military. So that could be. Okay. Taoism or Taoism. One of the things that really irks me about the spelling, the English spelling of Chinese words, that they don't seem to use the correct letters. I mean, it's not like the Chinese are making this. It's somebody in English makes these words from Chinese and they use the wrong letters. So I understand this is Taoism. It's like a T, but they use a D. So I say Taoism. So this Lao Tzu lived round about the same time as Confucius. And this is kind of the other side of philosophy. This is the more mystical side. You ease into the rhythm of the universe. Personally, I'm much more of a Confucian person because it's concrete, it's understandable. When somebody says that I need to get in touch with the universe, I say I have no idea what you're talking about. So he's also the live and let live, don't push your rules on people, do not force strict rules upon people, let them do what is natural. This is where you have the yin and the yang, duality, a balance of male features and female features, which I kind of like that. That's, the whole balance of nature kind of thing sounds nice to me. And then you have, and again, why a Q when it's pronounced Qin? I don't know. Somebody thought that was a good idea. But this is the most famous ancient ruler. This is the guy, he became the emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. He conquers the Zhao in 221 BC. Lived a few more years later to 210 BC. This guy was a very talented administrator. He could get really brutal and he killed an awful lot of people, but he knew how to run a government. He knew how to organize. And this is his greatest contribution. The great contribution to Chinese history is he got everybody to agree on things like the centralized government. He unifies the coinage so that everybody uses the same coins. He standardizes weights and measures. So each county or each city doesn't use different standards for weights and measures. He standardized the widths of carts. And that was just as important as back in the day when the railroads started in the Western world, to have the railroad tracks all measured the same distance apart. It's something that you don't really get in our modern age when you have roads that are nice and hard. But back in the day, the width of a cartwheel was very important because they dug into the mud. And the dirt paths would have grooves in them. And so it was so extensive and so different in different parts of China that sometimes people would have to change carts. If you were driving across a long distance and you came into a different territory, you would have to get all of your goods, take them out, and put them into a new cart because your cart wheels are going to be different from those that had made the ruts in the road. So he standardized. Everybody's going to have the same width of cart wheels. And I haven't mentioned the Great Wall, which was started much earlier than this. The Great Wall, by the way, was not originally just for the barbarians of the north. The Great Wall was not a wall. It was several walls because there were the warring tribes that were walling off each other. So in the Qin Dynasty, they're going to start connecting these various parts of the wall. And this is the guy, of course, with the Terracotta Army. It was said that he died. When he died, he was on a long trip to see a man about finding the elixir of eternal life. So the irony is, he went on this trip and he died, trying to get the elixir of life so he can live forever. And this is the Qin Dynasty, or the empire. A little bit larger. He was a great military leader and conquered a lot of territory. And yet, as you can see, here's the Great Wall, and here's another section of it, completely separate. And by the way, this Great Wall looks nothing like the Great Wall that you will see today. The Great Wall that we see today was made much later on in a different dynasty. Then we get to the Han Dynasty, very short-lived, but this is a more sophisticated China, a more unified China culturally and economically. And this is the great triumph, I think, of Chinese history, is that the reason that China is still a unified culture, and historians will tell you it is the longest lived culture in the world that is still, pretty much the way it was 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And the reason it is because they organized and unified so many parts of their society. And it was the Qin Dynasty that did a lot of that. So, the Han Dynasty, less harsh, not so brutal as the Qin. So here's some of the new innovations. Water clocks, sundials. The architecture is getting much more sophisticated. And this is the first contact with the West. They reached, envoys went out as far as the Caspian Sea and learned about the Roman Empire. They didn't get to the Roman Empire, but they learned something of it, because they knew that they were trading. Their silks were traveling all the way to the Roman Empire, and so they were learning more and more about the West. Nomads with the steppes. This is always a great concern, how to deal with them. And over the thousands of years that China has had to deal with the nomads, off and on, they're very clever, and sometimes not so much. But they do various things like pitting one tribe against another, because the nomads were not, of course, one tribe. There are several tribes, usually fighting with each other. So you send your envoys and your military out there, and you go to one of those tribes, and you say, look, we will help you out fighting that other tribe. And they love to take the help. And so you keep them fighting amongst each other so that they don't invade China. And that has worked off and on fairly well. Another thing that you do with the northern tribes is you can convince them that farming is a better lifestyle than the nomadic life, because you have a much more stable life. You have more, your food is a lot more consistent, because you can grow your food and you can store it, and so you have a stable food supply, and so that periodically works pretty well too. The perennial problem in China also is the overcrowding of peasants. They are so good at producing food that their population grows. And as it grows, there's less and less land for each individual. And so you get the landlords who own lots of land, and they start oppressing the poorer peasants who own nothing. And that's a theme that will be played over and over again. And so here is the Han Empire. And there's the Great Wall and this other piece off of it. Then we come to the 6 Dynasties period. China breaks apart. And again, this is something that happens periodically through Chinese history as well. Southern China is divided into 6 dynasties. And then there's the steppe nomads who invade the north, as they periodically do. Those who are prosperous and educated, they move south because it's safer there. One of the reasons that the south is safe is because there's a lot more marshland in the south. The farmland is more difficult for horses to invade. And so the nomads of the north usually invade northern China when they invade and leave the southern part alone because it's just too difficult for them. Literature thrives at this time. Chinese literature has a great tradition and is at least as sophisticated, or probably more so, than European at this time. And this is about the time that Buddhism becomes more popular. When there are difficult times and people are being killed and the times are unstable, people often look to religions for solace. And Buddhism is a religion that gives people real solace. Trade with India is flourishing at this time and brings great prosperity to those who are involved in it. So here's the 6 dynasties. The Qin at the bottom here being the largest, and then these others less so. So Buddhism in China. It was first brought to China around about 65 AD, but never really took off. It wasn't widespread until about 400, and it was the steppe tribes who brought it.
From where?
Well, from India is where it originated. So it very gradually came across the steppes. So I put down this quote because it encapsulates the ideas of Buddhism a lot better than I could. And this is actually from this textbook. It offered a profound philosophy and a coherent explanation of life and the universe, taking into account facets of human suffering and destiny upon which Chinese philosophy had nothing to say. So it was a new facet of human experience that Buddhism could bring to the Chinese people, and they welcomed it because in troubled times, again, people often turn to they look for some sort of solace for their sorrows, and Buddhism was a way that many people could deal with it. Then we come to the Sui Dynasty. This was very short-lived, 589 to 618. There were only 2 emperors. Both of them were fairly effective leaders, good administrators, built grand palaces. They first developed the examination system, and this was bedrock for the bureaucracy in China. One of the reasons that China was as successful as a country. Again, they're unified and their bureaucracy. If you were going to be a bureaucrat in China, you had to pass a very rigorous test. And this is when it first starts. They wanted their bureaucratic employees to be intelligent, and not because they're somebody's brother-in-law. They get these jobs because they earned it. They study for years. A terribly brutal process as it developed over the centuries. You do not become a bureaucrat unless you are very intelligent and have worked very hard and diligently to pass this test. And so, great credit to the Chinese people that so early on, when so many other governments throughout the world, their bureaucrats are people who have connections, not because of their intelligence or because they have the abilities to run these various offices. But in China, you had to be educated, very highly educated. Okay, they dug the first Grand Canal. As a very agricultural society, you need water transportation, and this Grand Canal became an excellent way of moving goods from one place to another. And so their distribution system was improved tremendously through this series of canals, which could bring rice from the southern plains. And then, of course, they extended the Great Wall. Almost every one of these dynasties worked somewhat on the Great Wall. And then you have the Tang Dynasty. How many of you have ever heard of the Tang Dynasty? Okay, good, good. You're more educated than I thought. Credit for it.
Because the greatest pots were made during the Tang Dynasty.
Very good, very good.
I'm a pot.
So, historians are generally in agreement that this is the greatest of the dynasties, the Tang dynasties. In my mind, I always thought of the Ming Dynasty as the one that stands out, because I think of a Ming vase that were so popular in Europe that they produced. And so in my mind, it was always the Ming Dynasty that stood out. But historians will tell you the Tang Dynasty is probably the greatest of all of them. They were from the northwest of China. It was from 618 to 907. Their military was very powerful. They extended their territories, built more canals. The examination system was more firmly developed. Literature is flourishing. Women are given more rights. They have rights in marriage. They can divorce their husbands. They have property rights. It was a very cosmopolitan time where people from various parts of the world could live in these cities. The Koreans, Vietnamese, the Mongols, and you could go to the major cities and see various cultures at the time. And of course, like all of these dynasties, in the end, they fall apart probably because of their luxuries. They get lazy. They become soft, like us Americans, and they are not as diligent. They're not as militaristic as they once were, and so things just kind of fall apart. So I have at the bottom some other things that were invented. This is when gunpowder is first invented. Of course, here's another irony. The gunpowder was invented by someone who is coming up with the elixir of life.
Wow.
To extend life indefinitely. This is throughout the world, I'm sure. The scientists, alchemists are working on making something that will make people live forever. And he came up with something that killed lots of people. So gunpowder is invented. This is when porcelain is invented. The only woman emperor, Empress Wu, ruled at this time. An able and capable administrator, but could be very brutal as well. Killed thousands of people who opposed her. And many consider the Tang the greatest dynasty, and I wish I could talk more about it, but I have to move on. So here is Turkestan is the territory that they invaded and extended their boundaries. But this is the Tang Empire. So once the Tang were finished, and again, lots of reasons for them to fall apart. Unrest among the peasants, famines and floods, government laziness or corruption. And so China pretty much just breaks up. So we have the 5 dynasties in the north and the 10 kingdoms in the south. And this lasted 60, 70 years. And then we have the Song Dynasty. Isn't that a lovely name for a dynasty? The Song Dynasty. General Zhao founds the Song Dynasty, 970. Again, the reason that China could come together again like this after so much disruptions is because they basically have the same culture that has been built into their society. They still have the educated people. They still have the examination system, the unified weights and measures, the carts with all of the same width of their wheels. So each time they break up, they are drawn back together again fairly easily, although they may not think so at the time, but they unify. So we have new innovations. Again, the compass is invented and used to navigate. Gunpowder is now used in fireworks and missiles. It's a misnomer that early on, the Chinese never used gunpowder in a military sense, that it was just for fireworks. They did use gunpowder for missiles to shoot at people in the military. They had a hydraulic-powered astronomical clock tower that pretty much measured the constellations and followed that. And what I was truly impressed with are their magnificent landscape paintings. Imagine comparing these paintings with what was passed off as painting in Europe at this time. It would be like, I mean, to me, it's like comparing a kindergartner with a master in art. This is truly just fantastic, very impressive paintings for this time. And you'll notice a very thematic difference between paintings in China and paintings in Europe. Does anybody tell me just the stark difference, aside from the quality, what's going on?
Religion. Most of them in Europe were based on Christianity.
Yeah, religion and the
Nature.
yes, this is nature. Where is man in these paintings? Look at this. Here's a guy, this tiny little man in this great landscape. Here are tiny little people in this great landscape. And here's tiny little buildings in this great landscape. It's completely opposite. In Europe, if you have any nature at all in the painting, it's as an afterthought in the background. Maybe you'll notice it. And here is entirely different. And here is the Song Empire. You have the Qin and these guys here.
So,
Yes?
so now we've gone from a cluster of many different empires and dynasties and stuff to now we're 3.
At this time, yes.
Okay.
So the Song, and I could cover this a lot more, but I just don't have the time. But yeah, the Song Dynasty is kind of broken up a little bit because there was invasions from the steppes tribes. So there's actually a Song Dynasty that encompassed all of China, and then there's the later Song Dynasty that was just the southern part.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we have the foreigners, the complete outsiders, the Mongols who invade. And of course it was not Genghis Khan who took over China, but his grandson, Kublai Khan, who finally conquered the south. As I said before, the south was much more difficult for them to conquer because horses don't get around nearly so well in the marshy lands of the south. But Kublai Khan finally did. And so there was the Mongol rule, the Yuan dynasty from 1280 to 1368. And so when the Mongols took charge of China, as virtually all races do, when you take over another country, you put your people in charge, and you separate, and you make sure that your people are treated better than those people. They were very discriminatory. That is a universal thing back in these days.
How do you define race?
How do I define race?
Because nowadays we're hearing these arguments that race was invented because of the black-white, and there's no biological basis to race. What do you?
Well, I'll tell you what. Any Chinese person could tell you that is a Mongol, that is a Chinese person by looking at them. Okay, that's how you say that's this race and that's that race because they look differently.
So you don't agree that it was invented recently?
Well, nobody does. That makes no sense at all. That makes no sense
sir,
at all.
that's not true.
Well, it's race by another name. I mean, it's just not modern day nonsense.
Troublemaker.
Yeah, well, it's like, well, what do you call it? If it's not race, then call it something else. But it is a difference.
Just like pornography, you know it when you see
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Yeah, thanks for that interjection. Okay, so the Mongols invade, and they have their people in charge as governors of the various districts. The Chinese are discriminated against in their own country. Intermarriage is forbidden. Classic literature, however, the Mongols really liked. And so they would translate that, and they would try to become more educated themselves because they realized that the Chinese were far better educated than they were. And of course,
where did the Mongols come from?
Mongolia.
South?
that's the north. Watch. Look at this. So here is the Mongols. That's where Mongolia is. Yeah, they are among the steppe tribes. And in a sense, it's almost incorrect to say that the Mongols invaded, because when Genghis Khan invaded, he used many, many tribes. Before he was like the ruler of that area up in Mongolia, he was just one tribe. The Mongols are only one tribe among many tribes. And so he unified them, brought them together, and then could invade various territories. So we call it the Mongol invasion because it was the Mongols who were the core tribe, but there are many tribes. So anyway, so because the Mongols had conquered pretty much everything from China to Europe, the Silk Road, trading goods, flourished at this time. And so the silks and other Chinese goods, the pots, the porcelain, could be traded across vast distances very securely. And at this time, the Europeans are just starting to get some of the goods, the new inventions from the Chinese. So the Europeans are introduced to gunpowder. for the first time. Block printing is brought to Europe at this time. And playing cards are also brought to Europe from the Chinese. So here's the Yuan Empire. And then we have the Ming Dynasty. Another great dynasty for a number of years. Not quite as great as the Tang, but this is, for our perspective, is when China starts to become a modernized nation, because Europeans are now reaching China. So the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, this is where the Great Wall of China is truly built. What we see today is built during the Ming Dynasty. The great overhaul of the wall is built at this time. So they were really big on infrastructure, roads, canals, bridges, the Great Wall. All of this is being worked on. And of course, as we know, multitudes of Chinese die in the process of building all of these things. Hundreds of thousands. The Great Wall is also a great graveyard of Chinese bodies. So, also, we think of the expeditions, naval expeditions at this time. We have Christopher Columbus, we have Bartholomew Diaz, and other great Spanish and Portuguese, Italian explorers in their ships going great distances. They are nothing compared to what China could do at this time. The naval expeditions of Zheng He, and I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, he personally led 6 great expeditions. The ships that he could sail had thousands of men in them. In one expedition, there were upwards of 28,000 sailors in several ships. When Christopher Columbus sailed, he had he sailed with his 3 ships and maybe 36 sailors on one of them, okay? So Christopher Columbus was nothing compared to what the Chinese could do at this time.
What they find?
Well, there was 6 expeditions of Zheng He, and he explored the areas around. He went over to India and explored, went over to as far as Africa on one of his expeditions, and brought back things like giraffes and exotic animals to show to the emperor. So yeah, truly amazing for the time. And once he came back, and after his last expedition, the emperor shut him down. Said, you know what? China has everything we need, and there's nothing really of interest beyond our shores. So we're done. And then the Europeans took over. Also at this time, the Forbidden City was built. A 14-mile square, 40-foot walls. How many of you have been to the Forbidden City? Quite magnificent. I have an older brother who visited many years ago. Quite magnificent, isn't it? And this is the time when the Jesuit missionaries are arriving. The Spanish and Portuguese missionaries are coming over at this time. And as a way of ingratiating themselves into Chinese society, they're not just pushing the Catholic religion, they're bringing Western science to China. And this was the hook that they had that really interested the educated Chinese, because it was a science that was very different, in some ways more advanced, in some ways less, but it was different. And so they were absolutely fascinated with the way that the Western world was thinking in scientific terms. And of course, porcelain became a huge deal in Europe when it was brought back. It was all the rage. If you were a wealthy person in your mansion or royalty, you wanted porcelain in your home. And here's the Ming Empire. So you notice that in pretty much all of these maps, that this area here is always the core part of the empire. Even today, if you cut off this part of China, something like, and I wish I had the numbers and I don't have them right now, but something like 90% of the population is here and 10% out here. And I know that's not exactly right, but it's close to it. The vast majority of the population is still in this area. And a lot of it is because, of course, this is very mountainous terrain out in this area. Okay, moving on to the Qin Dynasty. This is the last of the dynasties. One of the themes that happen many times in Chinese history, you have eunuchs at court, and you give them various positions in the government, and sometimes you give them authority, and sometimes that gets a little out of hand. If you have an emperor who is intelligent, hardworking, and is trying to run the country himself, the eunuchs stay in check. If you have an emperor who wants to just enjoy life and have a good time with the harem that he has, and go on vacations and enjoy the imperial palace and the beautiful grounds that they have, then the eunuchs take charge, and then you have problems, because the eunuchs will fight amongst each other, and they become very corrupt. And this is a theme that periodically in Chinese history happens and brings down the empire because of the infighting and the corruption. And this is what happened with the Ming Dynasty. So you have the Jurchen leader, one of the northern tribes, unites the Manchurian tribes. And so it was the tribes of Manchuria, the Manchus, who are now in charge in China. And they are seen as somewhat of outsiders, not so much as the Mongols, who were completely outsiders, but the Manchus, who had been kind of on the edge. They had lots of ties with both sides, the steppes tribes and the settled farmers in the south. But they were outsiders, and they were different from the Chinese. And so, again, you have the distinctions. You are either one of the upper crust of society, as a Manchu, the people who are in charge, or you are a Chinese. And you have discriminatory laws once again. So the Chinese were not allowed to live in Manchuria, that area. Again, no intermarriage between the Manchus and the Chinese. And this is where the braided hair, the queue, all Chinese men are by law to wear this haircut, where you shave the head halfway back and you have the long braided hair, the queue. By law, all Chinese men had to wear this. And something that I haven't brought up at this time, something that had gone back to roughly the year 1000, give or take, and that is foot binding of women. So here's some of the Chinese and Manchurian styles. Here's a very elaborate outfit for the palace guard. Here is the horrific practice of foot binding that was very popular up until the turn of the century, the 1900s. It was not all women did it, but the vast majority did. So, yeah, how that came about, other than just fashion madness, I don't know. And for a mother to inflict this on her daughter, yeah, pretty crazy stuff. And here's the hairstyle that all Chinese men had to wear. Here's beautiful silk dresses of the women. And this, who can tell me what this is?
Opium?
The opium dens. That developed, as we shall see. Now, the one thing in favor of the Manchus, the Jurchen tribe of the Manchus, when they took over, even though they were discriminatory, they became, in a sense, more Chinese than the Chinese. They loved Chinese culture. Chinese, for several years at first, were used as slaves on the farms. Then they realized it's better to not have slaves, but have something along the lines of tenant farmers. The emperors gradually grew to love Chinese culture so much that they almost completely adopted it as their own. The literature, the arts and sciences, they created a huge encyclopedia of their civilization, created a very sophisticated dictionary. The novel becomes very popular. And as I say, they were more Chinese than the Chinese in their love of that culture. And then we have the European onslaught, the late 1700s into the 1800s. The British East India Company, that is a topic that I think would be fascinating to get into. The British East India Company was created as a trading company, and it grew to be virtually a nation unto itself. They built their own docks, they built their own ships, they had their own armies and navies. Their navies were superior, their ships were superior to the British Navy ships. They could trade and make trading treaties with foreign countries, just as if they were a nation. So, hugely powerful for several years. So anyway, the British East India Company got permission to build their docks and harbors in Canton so that they could trade in Chinese goods. And they had a season from October to March in which to do it. But they were only allowed that one harbor in Canton. And in the mid-1700s, Chinese tea becomes all the rage in Europe. And so the British East India Company was making lots of money in this. The problem is that they had to pay for it with silver by law in China. They were required to pay in silver. So they had to get silver. They could buy, they could sell things and receive silver. So they traded in cotton, wool, tin, and then the infamous opium. Opium became the greatest trading good that they had because they could get it very cheaply in India and bring it over, sell it, and receive silver for it so that they could pay for the tea. So an interesting event happened, 1793. The British send an envoy, Lord Macartney, to the Chinese emperor because they want to expand. That's the British way. Something's going good, you got to get more of it. So they say, we want more harbors to ship from in various parts of China. But coming before the emperor, you have to kowtow. And we all know what that is, right? You get on your knees. You bow your face to the ground. That is kowtow. And the British were not going to do it at this time. Previously, Europeans would do this. They're getting to the point where they're saying, no, that is not our way. And so there was an impasse and negotiations. And so they said, well, look, what do you do for your king? Will you go down on one knee? And they said, okay, you can do that. So that was the compromise. I'll go down on one knee before the emperor, but I'm not going to kowtow. He brought many gifts, as is customary in European negotiations and dealings with foreign countries. You bring gifts. The Chinese saw that as tribute. Of course you're bringing many gifts. Britain is one of our tribute nations. You are submissive to the superior Chinese. And that is how they took it, because that's how all countries were to behave towards China. They asked for more harbors. They were not granted any. No, you are not going to get any more harbors. We don't need any more. And basically told that the Chinese don't really need anything from Europe, so we're fine with the trade as it is. They tried again in 1816 and again told no. Then we had come to the Opium Wars. The Trade Commissioner, opium was being outlawed in China. It was not outlawed in Great Britain or in Europe, but China could see how awful it was destroying so many families in China. So they were outlawing it, and it was just ignored. So this trade commissioner seized several opium cargoes, and so the British attacked and captured several ports, ending up with the Treaty of Nanjing, and the British basically said, we demand more ports to trade with the Chinese. And under the gun, they said, well, I guess we have to. But still, the Chinese were being difficult. They did not want the opium, the government anyway, and were still outlawing the trade. And so once again, the Chinese, they capture a British ship out because they're still smuggling. Now the French and other countries are getting involved. They attack several ports, and they get more concessions, more ports to trade from, and freedom of travel throughout China. Now, the 1800s, I must say, was a very terrible time for China because there were many things going wrong, not just their relations with European countries. The Taiping Rebellion, a young man, Hong Jiquan, leads a religious rebellion, a quasi-Christian religion that he kind of came up with. He said that he was the brother of Jesus, and his kingdom is the heavenly kingdom, and it appealed to an awful lot of people, especially since they're being ruled by the Manchus, this foreign people. And so a Chinese person who had a lot of charisma really appealed to a lot of the poor. And so he took over a good chunk of territory in southwest China, and eventually the British, the French, and the Chinese conquered them. But this was, look at the years. 1850 to 1864. That is a long time to cut out a huge chunk of China and rule over it. And the numbers are staggering. Between 20 and 30 million people died in the various conflicts between this group and the Chinese military. So this was the territory that the Taiping took over. But if that wasn't enough, you have the Neon Rebellion. You have a series of floods on the Yellow River, groups of bandits who band together because they are starving. So many things are going wrong. And this is, again, 1853 to 1868. They carve out their territory. They're a large criminal organization because they were involved in theft, kidnapping, and other sorts of crimes. They cooperated a little bit with the Taiping, but not enough to amount to anything. They ultimately could not stay organized, and their rebellion was crushed with something like 100,000 who were killed. And if that wasn't enough, you have the Muslim rebellion. In the West, there were large Muslim communities who did not like being discriminated against. And when the Chinese found that there were nice gold mining areas in those territories and wanted to take them, the Muslim people rebelled. So there are basically two groups of Muslims in the Northwest and the Southwest. Chinese wanted to take the gold mines, so they rebelled, create their own territories, 1856 to 1873, again, round about the same time. And upwards of 1 million people die in this conflict. And so this is the Panthay Rebellion here and here. And then we have the Sino-Japanese War in a dispute over Korea. Who's going to be the overseer of Korea? 1894, China has been traditionally the country that kind of oversees Korea, the big brother as it were. And now that Japan is modernizing at a rate far faster than China, Japan wants to get in on the action and take care of Korea for themselves. And basically that's what they did. They invaded, and it was the Japanese send their troops and ships. They invade not only Korea but Manchuria. And they destroyed what was the Chinese Navy because they're far more modern. And so they take Korea, Taiwan, and the Liaodong Peninsula in China. And they force China to pay a huge indemnity on top of it. So China is struggling to modernize. This was a great debate in China. Many people of the old ways said, no, we need to be Chinese. We should not adopt all of these newfangled technologies and ways of the West. And the others who say, look, they are going to destroy us. They have the technology that we need. So there was an interesting saying, Chinese learning for substance, Western learning for application. Sounds nice if you can work that out in your society. But still, they were very slow to build railroads, modern factories, and things that they needed to become a modern country. And then, if that wasn't enough, the greatest flood in recorded history, 1887, upwards of 900,000 are killed in this great Yellow River flood. And then we have the Boxer Rebellion, 1900. The famines and floods that are going on cause a lot of desperation amongst the populace. And so this Boxer group, banner of the righteous and harmonious fists. There's a lot of terms that might go with fists, but harmonious has never been one that really came to mind when I think of it. But this is the banner of the righteous and harmonious fists. They were anti-foreign, anti-Christian, and anti-modern. One thing that I can't get into that I wish I could is the huge missionary movement, the Protestant missionary movement of the 1800s in China. But the Boxers were very much against Christianity and killed thousands of Christian converts. And the imperial government decided that they were going to side with the Boxers against the foreigners. But of course, the Europeans put that down. 8 nations, European nations, actually 7 European, let's go back, 6 European nations, plus the United States, plus Japan, joined in and put this Boxer rebellion down. And approximately 100,000 were killed in that one. Then we come to the end of Imperial China. Everybody knows that reforms are needed, and they want constitutional government. At the time, the government was pretty much run by the mother of the emperor, and a very bitter and angry and evil woman who treated people very cruelly and did not want to modernize. We have Sun Yat-sen, who's leading the movement for modern China to put an end to imperial rule and have a constitutional government. People's nationalism, people's democracy, and people's livelihood. That was his slogan. So the emperor, Guangxu, was poisoned by his mother the day before she died of old age. That's about how cruel she was. And then you have the Wuchang Uprising in 1911, puts an end to imperial rule for all time. And you have Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China. He became the president of China for exactly, I think, 1 day and stepped down. But anyway, I know I've gone past, but hey, 3,000 years doesn't go by easily. Any questions? Yes?
Just a comment. I took a class in China in college taught by a Chinese man, and he said one of the problems, the biggest problems that China had throughout its history is that they spoke 1 million different kinds of languages and you couldn't talk to each other. He said it wasn't until they mandated Manchurian? Mandarin. Yeah, Mandarin, that got fixed, but he said it caused tons of problems.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, that's something that I was not able to get into, but thank you for bringing that up. Anything else?
The language, they speak differently, but the written is the same.
Right, they have the same characters throughout, so that was very helpful. Yeah. Okay, next week is Mao Zedong, the last of the great monsters.
Thank you.